If we had to sum up 11.2 balance in 3 words, it would be massive buffs. Well, kinda. There were a lot of winners in the patch, but as always, some were more lucky than others. And today, we're here to update you on our predictions for the solo shuffle meta in Season 3. If you haven't noticed by now, the start of the season is always complete chaos. Flavor of the Month specs are coming out of nowhere to kick the butts off of everyone else. It's hard to keep up. Even gearing is always a confusing process. But if you're a skill cap member, we've taken all the anxiety away thanks to our add-on that now shows BIS lists directly in-game, including gear, enchants, and gems, updating automatically each week. We even have talent strings that you can easily copy so you're never out of the loop. Of course, these aren't the only perks skill cap members enjoy, as you even get fully configured add-on profiles, which now includes 2-in-1 support for PvE. We've also got crazy effective courses on our website, including how to counter every class, the best positioning guides on the internet, and of course, the #1 class courses for gaining rating. SkillCapped has everything you'll need to hit your PvP goals, and that's because we continue to offer a rank up guarantee where we promise you can gain at least 400 rating while using our service. So, what are you waiting for? Visit skillcap.com today using the exclusive discount link below. And with that, we're going to kick things off by looking at the biggest changes to melee DPS. For all you DK mains waiting for a rework, your time has finally come with major changes to both Frost and Unholy on top of changes to every hero spec. In the preseason, Frost DKs were doing really well in Solo Shuffle, due in part to a few key changes, including a buff to Obliterate and Reaper's Mark, which could signal a swap over to Deathbringer. Now, for better or worse, Cleaving Strikes was reworked, which means a nerf to the iconic AoE blender damage the spec has been known for. But not to worry, because Frost Strike and Howling Blast seem to be doing more damage, and the new Frostbane talent might pick up the slack. As far as Unholy is concerned, the spec received a few key damage buffs, including an 8% buff to Death Coil, and now have more potential for AoE pad builds thanks to a redesign to Abomination Limb, which is now called Legion of Souls, and a brand new talent called Desecrate. Unfortunately, this shares a node with Raise Abomination, which is their bread and butter damage cooldown and a crucial part of their goes. There were also some class-wide changes to DK as a whole, including an unfortunate nerf to Anti-Magic Zone. Both DK specs were also hit with some last-minute tuning, nerfing the damage of Frost Strike and Festering Wounds inside of PvP. Altogether, we think DKs will feel quite similar to last patch, but might be slightly more comfortable to play thanks to the consolidation of some talents. Because of their last-minute nerfs, we expect both DK specs to land somewhere around the A tier. Now, if you play Demon Hunter, there were a grand total of 0 major changes this patch. Not to worry though, since DH was arguably the best melee in the game at the end of last season, especially in Solo Shuffle, where it completely dominated the top of the ladder. And if you are disappointed at this, just know that DH will have one of their best tier sets this season. Anyway, we think Demon Hunter will be returning to the S tier once again. Moving on, we have Feral Druid, which experienced a few changes, both good and bad. On the good side, Wild Stalker got a few buffs, and Feral originally got an 8% damage increase. Unfortunately, these both came with the nerf to Maim, increasing its cooldown by 10 seconds to match Kidney Shot. Not to mention the damage buffs were eventually reverted with some last-minute tuning. Overall, we think this is a wash. More damage is great, but it's harder to make use out of these damage buffs when you have worse control. Feral will continue to be a relatively polarizing spec with a high barrier to entry. Because of this, we think it will land somewhere around the A tier for most players. Moving on, we have Survival Hunter, who's getting some buffs to both Pack Leader and Sentinel, which are coming on top of some spec-wide damage buffs to Wildfire Bomb, as well as 2 brand new talents to beef up the damage of Killshot. The TLDR is that Survival could pump the meters. But just like Feral Druid, this is a spec that is a bit polarizing. It is definitely the most complicated Hunter spec to play, and as we will discuss later on, Beast Mastery is looking very promising. So for now, Survival Hunter will be joining the wildcard tier, potentially S for experienced players, but closer to A for others. Next up is Windwalker Monk, who is yet another spec to see almost 0 relevant changes this patch. This spec has been consistently high tier throughout the expansion, but did fall off after a nerf to Touch of Karma in Season 2. One reason we're not super optimistic for Windwalker is the buffs to its natural enemies, including Paladin and Mages. Anyway, Monk will be landing somewhere on the A tier. Speaking of Paladins, Rhett absolutely cooked with this patch, getting a list of damage buffs that is longer than the script of Lord of the Rings, with nearly every rotational spell getting a substantial bonus. In case you were out of the loop, Rhett was already one of the best melee in Solo Shuffle at the end of last season, and these buffs are relatively substantial. Even though it will still have some problematic lobbies, it will probably do extremely well in the early season. Because of this, we think the S tier makes sense. Next up, we have all 3 rogue specs, starting with Assassination, who also pulled away with some very substantial damage buffs, including a flat damage increase across the board and buffs to major rotational spells, though we should add that Garrett did get a last-minute nerf. Before you get too excited, we're going to spoil the fact that Holy Paladin will probably be the best healer early on, and with buffs to Rets, Evokers, and Survival Hunters, Assassination Rogues will have a lot of natural predators. And with that in mind, we think it will be a bit of the wild card S+ tier in some lobbies, but heavily countered in others. Moving on, Outlaw was easily one of the worst melee last season, which is why Blizzard stepped in with a flat damage buff, on top of a redesign to Killing Spree, which seems to absolutely pump as long as there are no random pets to soak its damage. Usually it takes a while for Outlaw to catch on, but these changes do look very promising. Overall, every rogue spec is looking fairly competitive, and by the way, Sub didn't get changed at all. We think Outlaw will still be the worst rogue spec, and Sub will land on the A tier for most players. Next up, we have Enhancement Shaman, which is a spec that is somehow always S tier on NA and C tier on EU, at least at the top of the ladder. If you want to know why, just ask Ronnie. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. Anyway, Enhancement Shaman received 1 quality of life improvement in the patch, on top of getting some damage buffs with some last-minute tuning. For now, we're going to be a bit conservative, predicting that the spec will continue to be mid-tier for most players. Finally, we have both of our warrior specs, who got a GCD reduction to Hamstring on top of a flat damage buff and a 15% increase to Blade Storm. If you are a warrior main, you really can't complain. Overall though, we still think Arms will pull out ahead. After the nerf to Slaughterhouse last season, Fury fell a bit behind in the race, but will still be highly competitive and easily accessible for most players. Arms will be going on the S tier, with Fury landing somewhere in A. And that brings us to our complete prediction of the melee meta in the early season, but keep in mind, things can quickly change with weekly tuning. If you're still confused about Wildcard, every spec here could either land on S or A, and will need a bit more testing. But with melee wrapped up, let's pivot to check out what's happening to range DPS. First up, we have Balance Druid, who was fortunate to pull away with a flat 8% damage buff in PvE, which was doubled with another last-minute 8% buff, which is pretty crazy. This is a bit interesting, since Boomkins were already pretty solid at the end of last season, and always seem to scale exceptionally well with any damage buffs. With that in mind, we still have some concerns over their survivability, especially since a lot of melee got some big damage buffs. Because of this, Balance Druid is definitely a contender for the S tier. As far as Evoker is concerned, there was a class-wide rework to Nullifying Shroud, which now acts like Fade as a temporary CC immunity after using Verdant Embrace. This isn't super relevant for Devastation and Augmentation, but will be good for Preservation, as we will discuss later. Anyway, both DPS specs got some flat damage buffs, while the gimmicky Flame Shaper hero talent for Devastation also got a power bump. Last season, we thought Devastation was a bit slept on and was secretly one of the best casters, and we think these buffs definitely help. Evokers will continue to be the bane of any melee DPS and should fare pretty well in the early season meta. Devastation will be landing in the S tier, while Augmentation will continue to be a more gimmicky one-shot spec. When it comes to our last 2 Hunter specs, we should remind you that all 3 hero trees received buffs, with BM pulling away with a massive buff to Black Arrow and Marks getting a huge quality of life increase thanks to a change to Lunar Storm. We think Dark Ranger could be back on the menu for BM, as the Black Arrow buff comes with one massive change for the spec as a whole. BM Hunter Mastery was reworked to also increase the Hunter's own damage, which is a pretty big deal since it means more agency in Arena. Last season, BM was one of the best range DPS in the game despite not being the most flashy. And as far as Marks is concerned, the spec is getting a mix of buffs and nerfs. Overall, we think Marks Hunter will be highly competitive this season with the new Volley explosive shot build, and will continue to be infamous for its big one-shots. Sure, you might struggle in melee-heavy lobbies, but every Hunter spec will be very good in 11.2. We think Marks will easily be S tier, while BM will be a bit of a wild card. Now, when it comes to Mage, we have some good and bad news. Well, depending on who you ask. First, the bad news for you mages, Time Anomaly was completely removed. This was one of the best talents in the game, but not to worry since each spec got some juicy buffs, especially Arcane, who saw buffs to Spell Slinger on top of a rework to Mastery, and a few key damage increases sprinkled here and there. Oh, and for all you proud supporters of the Arcane Dream, Nether Flux is a brand new PvP talent that replaces Touch of the Magi and offers crazy one-shot potential every 15 seconds. So crazy, in fact, that Blizzard eventually slapped a 60% nerf on the ability, which will tone the spec down from its preseason god tier status. This new ability was exceptionally broken, especially with last season's tier set, so it remains to be seen whether Arcane will remain OP this week. Fire Mage was also looking pretty hot thanks to buffs to Meteor and Pyroblast, which is like the 20th time we've seen something like this in the War Within. Unfortunately, in some last-minute tuning, Meteor's direct damage was slightly nerfed. In any case, we think Fire was a bit undervalued last season. Of course, as a pure DPS class, most mages tended to gravitate towards Frost since it was the strongest, but we could see a resurgence of Fire this season for sure. And speaking of which, despite being one of the best specs last season, Frost got a small buff to its mastery, and originally got a 10% damage increase, which was eventually yoinked away. While Frost is one of the best casters in the game last season, it will probably feel relatively weaker as other range specs got pretty substantial buffs with the patch. For now, Arcane will probably be S tier, with Frost and Fire being somewhere in A. Moving on, we have Shadow Priest, who actually got a pretty substantial rework, including talent changes and some damage tuning sprinkled in. Shadow got a brand new talent called Void Volley, which was previously the name of a PvP talent, which is now renamed. And despite some last-minute nerfs, Void Volley looks very promising as it gives the spec another instant burst button after Void Torrent is pressed. And by the way, Void Torrent is now a 30-second cooldown. And even though Unfurling Darkness was removed, Shadow Crash now has 2 charges, which should make it easier to maintain dots on melee when under pressure. Shadow is another spec that will be hard to predict. Good players will likely excel, but inexperienced PvPers might continue to struggle into melee. Next up is Elemental Shaman, which was one of the best casters in the game last season, and might be even better thanks to a 15% buff to Lava Burst and a 10% damage increase to Earth Shock. We think Ellie is one of those lobby neutral specs in Solo Shuffle, and tends to do well as long as it can pump the meters. With a few key damage buffs, this really shouldn't be an issue, especially once this season's tier set is available, which looks promising for the spec. Anyway, it shouldn't be a surprise that Ellie will land on the S tier once again. Finally, we have Warlock, who is getting a quality of life change, especially for demo, as now Corruption deals instant damage, making it much easier to kill Grounding Totem. Going through each spec one by one, Affliction received a 4% damage buff on top of a 35% buff to UA, which we're guessing is to help offset the loss of last season's tier set. Anyway, you could argue that Affliction was the worst overall Warlock spec last season, and this might still be the case, especially considering Demonology got a massive list of changes, including some buffs to the Diabolist hero spec, which is played in some matchups. We should also note that Master Summoner was moved to the demo tree instead of being a PvP talent, which is a pretty nice buff considering the spec now has one free PvP talent to work with. And even though the spec was hit with some last-minute nerfs, we still think it will do very well in the early season. Finally, Destro was the Warlock spec to see the least amount of changes in PvP. Last patch, Destro was pretty solid despite a rocky start to the season. Overall, every Warlock spec is looking competitive, with Demo likely pulling out ahead. And that brings us to our complete picture of the Season 3 meta. Once again, keep in mind that weekly class tuning will definitely shake things up. But now, let's wrap things up by looking at the changes to healers in 11.2. First up is Resto Druid, who got some key Wild Stalker changes on top of a buff to Tranquility, which is a common theme of this patch, as every healer got their big AoE heal buffed. One key change in 11.2 includes a rework to Implant, which now causes wild growth to proc symbiotic blooms, which could signal a small change in your healing rotation as long as mana isn't an issue. Overall, Druid is looking like a very competitive healer this patch in Solo Shuffle. For now, we're going to conservatively place it on the A tier. Next up is Preservation Evoker, who's likely to benefit the most from the change to Nullifying Shroud. While this will be a nerf into comps without an offensive dispel, it might be a neat quality of life change into some of Evoker's counters, especially mages. We should also note that Preservation got a decent rework to its talent tree, including Just in Time, which now provides a second charge of time dilation. Just like Resto Druid, we think Evoker will be strong, but doesn't seem to be the best of the best. Next up is Mistweaver Monk, who got a weird rework to Vivacious Vivication, acting as a buff to the new hybrid build, but as a strict nerf to the traditional caster playstyle. Monks also saw buffs to Revival and Shaylun's Gift at the cost of a nerf to Chi Harmony. We know we've used this word a lot lately, but Mistweaver will continue to be a polarizing healer. Mistweaver will likely continue to dominate some lobbies while being completely countered in others. Because of this, we think that the A tier is appropriate for now. But now it's time to talk about Holy Paladin, who we think could be the best healer in the early season. Pally saw huge buffs to Herald of the Sun, which will likely be the meta hero spec, on top of a mini redesign to their talent tree, which includes a rework to Infusion of Light, which now procs off of random Holy Shot casts instead of crits. Paladin was already one of the best healers last season, and it seemed to pull away with the biggest buffs going into 11.2. So big, in fact, that Blizzard decided to slap on a last-minute 12% nerf. But not to worry, since the spec already had such an enormous lead that we think this is a bit of a wash. For now, Holy Paladin will be staying on the S tier. Up next, we have both of our priest specs, who each received some mana changes on top of buffs to their unique AoE heals, Ultimate Penitence, and Divine Hymn. Unfortunately, we don't think either spec will be exceptional in the early season. If you watch Seadu's tier list from last patch, he actually thought Holy was the worst healer in the game. And with other healers getting bigger buffs, we think Priests might lag behind. For now, we're going to be placing both specs on the mid tier. Resto Shamans will suffer a similar fate as their only relevant change is a buff to Healing Tide Totem, which again follows the theme of every healer getting a nice bonus to their AoE heal. Based on our conversation with AWC healers, Resto Shaman currently seems to be one of the worst off for solo shuffle, and a single Healing Tide buff doesn't really help much, especially in this era of crazy add-on notifications. Because of this, Shaman will also land on the B tier, giving us a complete picture of the anticipated healer meta at the start of Season 3. And if you want to rank up fast this season, you need to check out our courses on how to counter every class in PvP. We've also got the best positioning guides on the internet, and our famous class courses will teach you how to master your spec. We take concepts and break them down into bite-sized pieces, kind of like quests, but instead of experience, you gain rating. We've also upgraded our UI in Season 3 with brand new features, including in-game BIS lists and now a complete 2-in-1 hot swap between PvP and PvE. As always, we're continuing to offer our rank up guarantee, where we literally promise you will gain rating by using our service. Be sure to click the link below to get started with an exclusive discount for Season 2. For now, we want to thank you all for watching. See you soon.